It's such a blessing to be here with you. Thank you so much, Michael, for that wonderful introduction. It's really humbling, and I am just blessed, as I said, and grateful to be present with you. I do not take it for granted being here. When I'm in a church, just very quickly, sitting sometimes, and I'm having this opportunity to come up to the pulpit and speak. I remember when God gave me a vision of me doing this. And I was sitting in my church, which was smaller than this, but it's kind of the same kind of architecture, and it's kind of like that pew kind of right there. And I was just an engineer working out in the construction site, you know. And I just say, man, God, you're good. I would have never, I never tire of God's goodness and how he has come through and been faithful to me. So I don't take this for granted. So thank you so much for being willing to sit, engage, and listen to me this evening. Well, a little bit about my agenda, my research agenda. For the past 10 years, my research has focused on pastors, race, and social change. But, as Michael had mentioned, for the first part of my career, I looked at race and religion at the organizational level. In my books, The Elusive Dream and Against All Odds, I look at multiracial churches. And the overarching argument is this: multiracial churches work to the extent that white people are comfortable. What I find is that whiteness is normalized in these spaces, even in spaces where people of color are the numerical majority and the head pastor is a person of color. These churches work in this way because they are governed by what I call white hegemony, which is a concept integrating more fully the works of, if you're familiar with them, Omi and Wynant in racial formation theory, and the theorist Antonio Gramsci. Other subsequent work after these books has supported these findings. I also did some work on Black religious leaders' practices during Black church religious practices during the early part of my career, but my work on multiracial churches has been central to my research agenda. I then began to turn my attention to religious leaders because they matter for congregations. This work has looked at how clergy engage issues of racial justice in a diverse context, whether that be in their congregations or the broader space. Now, tonight I'll be largely drawing upon this work, which centers interviews with clergy to inform my discussion. I have two projects I've headed to address this problem. One, that was already mentioned, is a Religious Leadership and Diversity Project. This is the first ever comprehensive multi-method national study of multiracial church pastors. This project, as mentioned, was supported by a $500,000 grant by Lilly Endowment. Very grateful for that. The other project is called the Religious Leaders in Civic Activity in Ohio. That is a multi-method study of Black religious leaders in Ohio and the civic leaders who wanted to work with them. This project was also funded, which I'm grateful for. Now, both studies take what I call a structural approach to the pastoral role, and those who came to my workshop earlier today heard me begin to talk about this. And I draw upon a few theories. I draw upon what I call role strain theory, theories about American religion, race theory to inform my framing of the role. Now, just real quickly, a role is a set of expectations. A role is a set of expectations that people are supposed to fill. I'm just going to give you that. Now, I discussed this in an article called Role Strain Theory and Understanding the Role of Head Clergy of Racially Diverse Churches. Though it focuses on head clergy of these kinds of congregations, the framework is applicable to clergy generally, whether or not you're heading a multiracial church, because it ultimately is about understanding leadership. In short, I argue that to understand the pastoral role, we must understand the structures in which it is embedded. Now, we often, when we think about the pastor or the leader or the lay leader or in any particular leadership role you have, you just think about what you have to do, how I'm thinking about it. And we don't recognize that this is a part of a broader structure. Now, we can call these structures for shorthand the macro level structures, meso level structures, and micro level structures. As is demonstrated by this figure, what happens at the macro level affects the meso level, which affects the micro level. The micro level includes churches, organizations, for the sake of our conversation here, individual ones. The meso level includes your denomination. Right? You're part of a denomination, and there are expectations that come from your denomination. And then there are also those macro level structures that are society-wide, right? That you can go from different spaces, different institutions, and you will experience the impact of those. I focus on race and religion in America. Now, my book, Smart Suits, Tattered Boots, which came out in 2022, is based on the research from the Religious Leaders in Civic Activity in Ohio project. As I noted, this project is a multi-method qualitative study of Black religious leaders in Ohio. My former graduate student, who's also the co-author on the book, and I did this together, we conducted 54 in-depth interviews with pastors and civic leaders, 43 with pastors, 11 with civic leaders in the state who wanted to work with them. The guiding question of this research was this: when, how, and why do Black religious leaders collectively mobilize in 21st century America? When, how, and why do Black religious leaders collectively mobilize in 21st century America? This was motivated by just a basic, this was coming soon after the murder of Trayvon Martin, and I was wondering, where are the Black religious leaders? What's going on? What may have changed? How do we understand how they mobilize? And so I got in the field to study that. Any serious look at modern mobilization in the U.S. should start with the mobilization of Black religious leaders. I'm going to say that again. Any serious look at modern mobilization in the U.S. should start with the mobilization of Black religious leaders. Why? I'm glad you asked. Because Blacks are the only group of color that have established control over an institution separate from whites. That's the Black church. They are made of Black-controlled denominations, as well as Black people who attend largely Black churches. The civil rights movement also is important to think about because it upended established scholarship on mobilization in the U.S. I repeat, the civil rights movement upended established scholarship on mobilization in the U.S. Theory of modern mobilization since the 1970s is driven by empirical work on the civil rights movement. Now, briefly, we found in Smart Suits 4 factors that impact Black religious leaders' engagement in mobilization. 2 are internal to the Black religious community, and 2 are external. The external ones are these: relationships to civic organizations, the relationships that they have to civic organizations, and racism and white hegemony. What relationship do they have to civic organizations and racism and white hegemony? The 2 that are internal to the Black religious leader network are these: what we call the civil rights movement credential. That is to say, Black religious leaders who are a part of the network of Black religious leaders, if they had a credential of being tied to, connected to in some way to the civil rights movement, that elevated their leadership capacity in the network. Another internal factor is what we call the Black Protestant ethic. The Black Protestant ethic essentially is this: that Black religious leaders believe that Black people, that the racial inequality is in part tied to people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and also the macro level racist system. So they believe that Black people need to work harder to do what they're supposed to do to get ahead as individuals, and they believe in the structural component as well. For our purposes here today, I'm going to focus on Black religious leaders' relationship to civic organizations. We know that during the Civil Rights Movement era, Black religious leaders collaborated with Black-led civic organizations in their mobilization efforts. These partnerships were integral to the movement. Many of these organizations, such as the NAACP, SCLC, and the Urban League, still exist today. Now, all these organizations maintained a presence in the state of Ohio, where we did the study at the time. There's even a chapter affiliated with the National Action Network, also called NON. NON was founded by Reverend Al Sharpton in the 1970s. And also a very interesting tidbit about Ohio is Fred Shuttleworth, that leader of the Civil Rights Movement, his church was in Ohio. Surprisingly, though, even with all the opportunities to do otherwise, and even with that Civil Rights Movement legacy in the state, most of the religious leaders in our study were not deeply engaged with these Black-led civic organizations. For sure, they had symbolic connections, as in membership, but not substantive involvement. Now, we have to keep in mind there is now another alternative on the scene that emerged after the Civil Rights Movement, and those are faith-based community organizations, or FBCOs. FBCOs really expanded in this country beginning in the 70s after the Civil Rights Movement. The PICO network, now called Faith in Action, which originated in 1972, now has a presence in at least 150 cities nationwide and is engaged in over 1,000 congregations in local and national mobilization efforts. The growing presence of these kinds of organizations has changed how social mobilization is done, and thus has implications for the efforts of contemporary Black religious leaders. One important implication of the growth of FBCOs is Black religious leaders have another viable option besides Black-led civic organizations for collaborative mobilization. The thing is, FBCOs are multiracial, ecumenical coalitions of faith communities. They use community organizing methods to work on a variety of social justice issues, including those tied to race. Yet even though FBCOs are racially diverse, they are largely, though not exclusively, led by whites. And while FBCOs are funded in part by constituent churches, including Black churches, they are also reliant, and one could even argue more so, on predominantly white funding institutions such as the Catholic Campaign for Human Development and other philanthropic organizations. While FBCOs do pursue racial justice goals that many Black religious leaders support, they do not center the needs of Blacks. Their aims tend to be more general, as they need buy-in from multiple constituencies, most of whom are not Black. Thus, when Black religious leaders contribute significant amounts of their own resources, financial and human, to campaigns that do not center the Black community, tension and distrust can emerge, both between Black religious leaders and FBCOs, as well as within the Black religious leader community generally. Still, despite these potential and real tensions, many of the Black religious leaders in our study were involved with FBCOs. So the question begs, why would Black religious leaders choose to work with these organizations instead of Black-centered civic organizations? One reason is they saw the utility of having the support of the professional organizing staff of FBCOs. Here's an example of a typical pastor in our study who had been involved in FBCO. One tactic of FBCOs is to mobilize people to motivate local government to address a particular issue. Reflecting on his experience, he said, so I might be up here talking in front of the meeting, but how did you get all these people to the meeting? We had staff that built relationships and called these people 50 times trying to get them all here. And it's a heck of a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. But for most of our organizations, we don't have staff dedicated to the outreach, collaboration, building type piece. This pastor saw the value of the FBCO model for community mobilization, but what is really critical here is he saw and valued the resources of the FBCO. The FBCO could do what his church could never do. They simply don't have the infrastructure for such an operation. However, this is not his preference. This is made clear later in the interview as he reflects on why his peers might be involved in FBCO. And he said this: some of them are getting involved just because of the vision of that interracial, multicultural type stuff. Some are getting involved because it's the best thing around, because as much as we would like to have these black coalitions, it don't look like it's happening anytime soon, or it's not strong enough, so they jump on that. There's a good deal to unpack here. But what I want to highlight is the sharp distinction between multiracial coalitions and black coalitions that focus on black issues. Most of the religious leaders who spoke about FBCO drew this distinction, whether they leaned more towards multiracial coalitions or black coalitions. In this pastor's mind, being a part of a multiracial coalition was attractive for some black religious leaders, but for him, the ideal would still be to have a black coalition. However, the possibility seemed unlikely in his local context because of a lack of resources that apparently black-led civic organizations did not have. So why do black religious leaders work with FBCO? One reason black religious leaders worked with a multiracial FBCO is because it was well-resourced and the best thing around for making collective action happen. They are not committed to FBCO per se. We have to remember pastors are not primarily organizers. They are, well, pastors, right? And pastors have a long list of responsibilities, right? These include sermons, counseling, performing various religious rituals, fundraising, managing staff, and so on. So the resources that FBCO offer are understandably attractive. Yet, there are some pastors who are more committed to FBCO. They believe in it. And we found these to be the younger pastors. In discussing involvement in FBCO and the local Black Ministerial Alliance, one well-respected young pastor said this: oftentimes, I would engage in efforts via clergy organizations, ministerial organizations, which certainly have their value, but I thought with respect to mobilizing people for large-scale change, that community organizing model, which looks at congregational involvement at the level of the pastor, but also at the level of involving the laity, to me, that's a game changer. He goes on to say, well, one of the great things with the Black Ministerial Alliance is it provides a great clearinghouse for information. For the group meeting on a weekly basis, we are made aware of new developments. Community leaders, political leaders, public officials will come to those meetings and inform us about what they're doing. So we will be informed as religious leaders, one, to weigh in on it, to provide feedback. Sometimes we'll share this information with our congregation as a community resource to communicate information to them. This young, respected pastor has chosen a different path of social engagement than his older, more established pastors, at least at this stage in his career. He was committed to mobilizing for social change through the FBCO model. So he was content with working outside of the Black church. This doesn't mean the Black church didn't matter to him. The Black Ministerial Alliance was especially helpful as an information repository. They developed and refined their collective voice in the alliance. They were also connected with civic leaders. But for him, this was not the place through which you mobilize for social change. In fact, he proposed elsewhere in the interview that it was FBCO that was carrying on the tradition of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other Black religious leaders of the civil rights movement. So, this pastor did not feel bound to any expectations that he should invest in the Black religious leader community, even when it came to issues of racial justice. He prioritized and believed in a multiracial ecumenical movement. But this could have been potentially problematic. Others in the Black religious leader network took notice. One established, active-oriented pastor who was well-respected and had those civil rights movement credentials expressed concerns about young Black pastors' approaches to social action. He discussed this at length in my interview with him, bringing up the topic on his own, and here's what he said. I think in some instances, some of the pastors come from Eastern Ivy League seminaries, and I think their training is like the folk church. This is how I interpret it. And I don't ever want to become so educated or so intelligent that I cannot relate to what I call my everyday folk pastors. Some of these pastors are very linked to a strong interfaith movement, an FBCO in the city. I don't have a problem with that. But I decided that this was a season where a lot of the younger pastors that had come back into the city ought to be spending as much time with the black pastors and organizing within the context of the heart and the soul of the black community versus some larger external interfaith effort. Clearly, this established pastor perceived that young black pastors ought to be working with their peers who were embedded in the black church rather than working with a diverse organization that is not rooted in the heart and soul of the black community. When these younger pastors work with multiracial FBCO, they are taking their resources outside of the black community and sharing them with others who may not center the material and social needs of blacks. The younger black pastors, though, are responding to macro-level structural changes, ones not so readily available to their older counterparts. They are able and choosing to go to predominantly white seminaries and divinity schools. Resources for mobilization are concentrated in diverse, white-led, white-centered spaces. Gone are the days when the only option for racial justice work required working in the black community and with largely black organizations. Time will tell if this young pastor and others like him will remain invested in the FBCO approach. While older generations of black pastors who worked with FBCOs at the beginning of their careers eventually stopped investing their energies in these efforts, this is a new generation. Diversity is still a dominant value, even though it's getting some pushback in the United States. And still, we see this expressed across institutions. If the Black Religious Leader Network is not effectively mobilizing for social change that improves the lives of African Americans, then perhaps some of the younger generation of black religious leaders in the 21st century will decide that the FBCO, a multiracial approach, not a black-led, black-centered one, is the way to go. But is diversity the way to go? Even with pushback against DEI, we still see that diversity is celebrated, from boardrooms to classrooms to Hollywood and so on. My work on multiracial churches and pastors of multiracial churches give me pause to the whole diversity, multiracial thing as a solution to the idea. As already mentioned, I have turned my attention to pastors. And in addition to black religious leaders, I have been studying multiracial church pastors with that RLDP. So why a study of multiracial church pastors? Well, the RLDP focuses on the experiences of pastors of multiracial churches to provide insight, into their capacity, into their capacity for generating social change, particularly as it relates to race. It's important to look at how they lead, since diversity is seen as the way by which many across institutions think of how to address racial injustice. So how is it that they navigate structures that on many sides work against what they're aiming to do? The RLDP, the first ever nationally representative comparative study of multiracial congregations, includes 120 personal interviews with pastors and denominational leaders. The majority of these were done in person, which I'm very grateful for, by the way, for pastors who spent time with me and my team. We had nearly 700 surveys with congregants and over 36 focus groups with 230 congregants. I'm going to be focusing on the interviews with pastors in my discussion today. The sample of clergy is diverse along several lines, including race, gender, sexuality. The clergy in our study hit congregations from a variety of different Christian religious affiliations, whether they're Catholic, mainline, or evangelical. They also represent congregations that are varying sizes. We have pastors that had congregations with 100 regular attendees, up to giga churches, 10,000 or more people. They had churches across the country and in all 4 census regions. I, along with several of my graduate students and colleagues on my team, published a series of articles with Sociology of Religion drawing on this data, and one of those was written by my co-author with Smart Suits, Tattered Boots, Michelle Oikawa. The article was called Racial Reconciliation as a Suppressive Frame in Evangelical Multiracial Churches. Oikawa focused on evangelical multiracial church pastors because of the rate of growth that we have seen among these kinds of congregations over the past couple decades. In 1998, multiracial churches made up only about 7% of evangelical congregations as compared to 22% in 2019. That's a big jump. Oikawa's analysis shows that a majority of these pastors draw on a racial reconciliation frame to address race, not a racial justice frame. A large majority, though not all, of the evangelical pastors in the study who adhere to a racial justice frame are white. A majority of the pastors who adhere to a racial justice frame are people of color, though not exclusively. So let's take a look at the table. To briefly summarize, a racial reconciliation frame emphasizes shared faith in building interpersonal relationships across race. A racial justice frame emphasizes openly discussing and dealing with racial injustices. The racial reconciliation frame views such conversations as divisive. They disrupt the supposed unity in the church, and consequently, racial reconciliation functions as a suppressive frame. It hinders dealing with the realities of race and racism and impedes any structural changes in the congregation or denomination. Now, politics are a large part of this. Multiracial churches are politically divided, and these political divisions generally fall along racial lines, and this has profound impact on pastors. One pastor succinctly clarifies the political and racial tensions that emerge in multiracial churches. And he says this: we have people who think, this is when Obama was obviously in office, we have people who think that Obama is probably the next best thing. And then you have people who probably think he's close to the Antichrist. How do you deal with racial justice in such a context without paying a heavy toll? You don't. When you do, people leave. And churches need people. Another evangelical pastor, this one, a Korean American, highlights the challenges of fostering diversity and trying to deal with racial justice at the same time. He says, it's not easy. You realize how different people are. You realize how challenging it is. Things that a homogenous culture would never have, like communications or disagreements about, like in a multicultural sense. You're having to tread carefully at times. I mean, we use Ferguson, for instance. And in a homogenous culture, whether black or white, this can be a real rallying, unifying thing, you know, for whichever perspective. But in a diverse church, you're thinking, man, how is this person going to take it? How are they going to take it? And you know what? You say, you're going to offend somebody most likely, so it's really hard. What we see here, again, are the challenges that come with heading racially diverse contexts and the extent to which you can actually address or deal with racial justice. There are continually these barriers that go to getting past diversity and dealing with actual structural implications. So we return to the clergy role being structured. Expectations of congregants and race as a structure and identity affect this pastor and how he thinks about and engages his role. And what is also evident is what he wants is not necessarily important here. He claimed to have socially progressive ideas when it came to race, but he was still bound by the structures, that of his congregation and broader macro-level ones in which he was embedded. When we consider white multiracial church pastors in this study, Catholic priests of multiracial churches are the most aware of systemic racism and demonstrate the most investment in dealing with issues of racial injustice. They are also most willing to disrupt the comfort of white congregants if need be. Now, I'm not saying all Catholic priests have this awareness or approach, but among the white pastors who head multiracial churches, Catholic priests are the most socially aware and engaged, at least according to our study. And in fact, when we saw racial justice-oriented pastors, it was more often among Catholic priests in our study, regardless of race. Now, we think this may have something to do when they came into the priesthood. Most were older, receiving their training during Vatican II and the Civil Rights Movement. So again, we talk about the experiences they had of socialization and also the structures that they were embedded in when they were trained. Still, Catholic priests face similar challenges as evangelicals who are more justice-oriented. Just because they are aware and engaged doesn't mean their congregants are aware and supportive. For example, one priest of a racially diverse parish shared a story with me that exemplifies the kinds of challenges priests have to navigate when they aim to do work that is justice-centered. He recalls a conversation he had with one parishioner about the immigration center affiliated with the parish. This person was inquiring about people who take advantage of the center. And this is what he tells me. They asked, here we go. They asked me, are all these people illegal? Yeah, all these people are undocumented. I said, well, not all of them. Oh, you mean some of them are? Yeah, some of them are. That's why they're here, to get their things straightened out. They come for the immigration center. People said to me, one lady said to me, so somebody comes to your office and they're undocumented? Yeah. So why don't you call the police? I said, well, because we're a church. We're trying to get people back on track and get their status adjusted and stuff. But they're illegal. And I said, well, yeah, but I mean, they came here and they want to start a life, and we can help them do that. We're a church, by the way. We're not the police. But some people just couldn't understand that. So doing justice and diversity is difficult for all pastors. But it is draining and lonely for pastors of color. My colleague Rebecca Kim and I have a book that was already mentioned, Strange Pioneers, Race, Faith, and Leadership in a Diverse World. This book expands on an article of the same primary title, Strange Pioneers, and in this we argue that leaders of color who leave their familiar ethno-racial home churches to explore a new way of doing church and leading multiracial congregations are strange pioneers. However, doing this work is not valued by their home religious communities, and they're left to navigate a racialized space, including in the multiracial religious communities they head, where they are consistently perceived and treated as inferior to their white peers. They are first dismissed, and then they are dissed. They're dismissed because being a multiracial church pastor is not compatible with the aims of their home religious communities, and they are dissed because they do not experience the same power and privileges as their white counterparts in multiracial congregations. Subsequently, leading in diverse spaces for people of color is a particular burden, an emotional, social, and perhaps one could argue, a spiritual burden. For instance, pastors of color experience a racial tax. That is the burden to overachieve because of a simple reality: people of color are perceived as less desirable or less capable leaders than whites. So to compensate for this, pastors of color of multiracial churches pursue more credentials in the form of special training, greater experience, more education. They strive to work harder than their white counterparts to prove to themselves and others that they can lead well. Oh, there we go. Consider Father Angelo. He's a Filipino priest. He's had decades of experience working in a mainline Protestant church. And he has thoughts on being a priest of color. Now, given the disadvantages the priests of color have, Father Angelo advises young priests of color to simply work harder, pursue greater credentials, and perform better than their white counterparts. He explains, I was telling our fellows, if you are the same or equal in stature and ability and education like the white fox, you are not going to make it. You have got to go beyond. If he, the white fox, is a star, you have to be a superstar. Now, whatever Father Angelo meant by calling a white person the white fox, What is clear is he believes one way pastors of color can deal with the racial prejudice and discrimination they experience is outperforming their white counterparts in their denomination or tradition. They do more because they do not feel that they are respected as authority figures, as are their white peers. An African-American mainline Protestant pastor concurs with Father Angelo. Like many other pastors of color in our study, he's highly educated with multiple degrees. Pastor Mills confessed that he tries to do everything with excellence. While this seems to be working to attract Latinos and Asians to his church, he has a hard time attracting white people because, in his view, they're simply unused to submitting to leaders in general, and especially leaders of color. He explains, "I believe that it's difficult for white people to have black leaders. I am as educated as any pastors you would find. We try to do everything with excellence here. A trained opera singer who has a master's in church music from, this guy's highly skilled, yet we find it difficult to attract and keep whites. We do not have that problem with Latinx people or Latinos. To a certain extent, we don't have that problem with Asians. What is my thesis for that? I think white people don't want to submit to leadership." Pastor Mills tries his best to compensate for his race and does everything with high excellence in an effort to encourage white congregants to support his leadership. But even still, he has to accept that it may not be enough. The racial tax, challenges to authority, the racialized political context can lead to personal, emotional, and spiritual burdens for pastors of color who head multiracial churches. I have another example. This is an Asian evangelical pastor that I interviewed. He says, there would be times when it would be a real struggle to feel like, man, am I even in the right? I know I'm leading this, but I think I can do a much more effective job somewhere else among people who are just, again, much more, at least, racially similar to me. And here's what happened in the past few months that's proven that true. There's been a sense at our church, especially with a lot of the Asian influx, I've been feeling much more comfortable in our church. So again, what we see are the burdens that pastors of color carry in heading multiracial churches. Their authority is challenged, they have to earn a lot more, do a lot more, and then even if they've started the church, even if they're leading the church, they don't feel comfortable. That might be a doggone shame. This pastor was so committed to diversity, as I said, he planted this church. And even though he started this enterprise, he doubts himself as a leader. But as the congregation changes, as there are structural changes in the racial composition of the congregation, he feels increasingly comfortable. A black mainline pastor who wrote his dissertation in multicultural religious space says this: it can be lonely. And it's in those times Jesus went to the mountaintop, Jesus went to the garden. He went on the other side of the lake, right, to get his batteries recharged. So for me, going to the convocation of black pastors, that is like me going to the mountain and getting recharged. The added burden is emotional for this pastor, but also time and energy. He has to go elsewhere to get what he needs to continue leading in a multiracial space. We live in a diverse world, not only numerically, but we live in a world that says it values diversity. Saying that you care about diversity is nearly a must for a lot of leaders of institutions and organizations, yet right along America's professed love affair of diversity, racial strife and injustice persist. We see racial discrimination, systemic police killings of black people, many of them children, harassment and violence towards Asians, families being separated at the border, to the resurgence of white supremacist groups across the globe, and mounting challenges to educating people of the social, legal, and historical institutionalization of racism and racial discrimination. Clergy are managing this reality of leading in a contentious climate where diversity is both acclaimed and assaulted. Opportunities have opened up for clergy, namely clergy of color. They attend prestigious, predominantly white seminaries and divinity schools. They work with well-resourced, largely white-led, multiracial collective action organizations. They are increasingly leading racially diverse congregations. But what I hope I have begun to show you here is this climate has implications for clergy who want to do racial justice work. We see this impact on pastors of predominantly black churches, where there's a strong legacy of racial justice work, and those who head multiracial congregations. Yet their capacity to address racial injustice has not necessarily improved. And perhaps one might argue it has declined. This is because multiracialism in the United States is a project that sustains whiteness. It gives it cover in a world where diversity and inclusion are increasingly lifted as important values, while at the same time reproducing an institution that centers whiteness. Christianity in the United States is by no means an exception. Indeed, several scholars have revealed the active role many white Western Christians, churches, Christian denominations, seminaries, and parachurch organizations have played and continue to play in protecting and developing white supremacy. It could be argued that it is in white Western Christianity where whiteness finds its strongest defenders and producers. So what are some theoretical lessons that we can take away from discussion today? Well, when we think about the meaning of diversity, what does that really mean? My research, as well as others who study racially diverse religious organizations, as well as those who study racially diverse neighborhoods, racially diverse school settings, consistently find that these settings maintain white comfort without justice. This is a consistent and persistent finding. What also happens is that people can claim a kind of moral superiority, right? Because what it does is it protects white actors who are actively involved in diversity when it doesn't really address justice. But it can also bolster the identity of people of color because you're hanging out and working with white people. And then at the same time, it can also reinforce colorblindness because you really just are satisfied with just hanging out and being together. I don't really see or want to acknowledge or engage the issues that are related to your race. Another theoretical lesson is whiteness is hegemonic, right? Everyone participates in that. And multiracial churches are embedded in an institution that is white hegemonic because it is embedded in white Christendom. Another lesson is we have to remember that leadership is structural. It is not just an individual project. It is always a structural project. And so we must deconstruct the structure if we're going to understand how to better lead racial justice issues in a multiracial space. Social networks and structure matter. They facilitate or constrain resources. When we talk about the emergence of the FBCOs after the 1970s and who gives to those organizations, that has implications for the kind of work that those organizations will do and the kinds of resources that will be distributed to different congregations and leaders. And then we cannot forget American religion and how it is organized in the United States. We colloquially say the separation of church and state. And what that means is religious organizations have to make it on their own. They're not supported by the state. And that means that in many ways, religious organizations are susceptible to the predilections of people that are in the pews. And if the people in the pews are impacted by a racist society and structure, then what are the implications of that for religious organizations? Even if the pastor is so socially progressive and down with justice, he still has to work. She still has to work. That has implications. And then we also have to remember at the same time, the American religious context facilitated the autonomous space of the Black church. U.S. Black religious leaders, they're the original agitators. Now, my work on head clergy and congregations has led me to ponder and reflect on the gospel and the words of Jesus and the prophets and the life of Jesus. And I've been returning to the work of theologians who engage matters of social change. One of these persons is Dr. Howard Thurman. I'm sure, how many people are familiar with Dr. Thurman? If you're not, you really need, thank you, sis. You felt me. Let me take this and keep moving. Dr. Howard Thurman was a theologian. He was a divinity school dean at Howard University and also, I believe, at Boston University. He's the author of many books. One that's the most well-known and famous is Jesus and the Disinherited. I encourage you to read that if you have not done so. He in many ways mentored Dr. Martin Luther King, even if indirectly so, because Dr. King really relied on his theological ideas. He was also the co-pastor and co-founder of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. This was probably the first intentional multiracial church. I heard several people talking about doing an experiment of co-pastoring. Well, he was doing that in the 1940s. He was a black pastor and co-pastored with a white pastor, this church. Influenced by Thurman, I wonder about the broader social context in which Jesus was born and lived, and why he died. Not the theological explanation, but historically, factually. He willingly allowed the state to execute him for challenging an empire that oppressed people, for their ethnicity, gender, class, for respecting them, for loving them, for empowering them. And I wonder, what does that tell us about God? What does it tell us about who we are and who we are to be? So a way forward that I'm going to propose. The Black church has been doing justice work in this country for 250 years. Since Richard Allen and Absalom Jones left the Methodist Church in the 1700s, even enslaved blacks mobilized. There were revolts, one famously led by Nat Turner. The Underground Railroad, for which Harriet Tubman, a Christian, formerly enslaved woman, was the primary guide and leader to freedom from slavery. A Black Moses, some called her. The Black church was the foundation of the civil rights movement. We don't always think about that. Yet, the Black church, nor its leaders, are followed in justice work today. Even the younger Black religious leaders are favoring multiracial movements. As my colleague and friend, Reverend Curtis DeYoung proposes, that perhaps the way forward for any clergy who want to do racial justice work is not about being racially diverse, but must go through the Black church. As Oyakawa and I discuss in Smart Suits, Tattered Boots, contemporary Black religious leaders have to make some adjustments if they want to lead for racial justice today. Still, it remains that it is the Black church that has the theological lens, structural base, and tested blueprint for leading the way forward. No doubt, despite all the barriers and challenges that come with doing religious racial diversity, multiracial churches and their leaders and multiracial religious movements have a role to play here. As we say in our book, Strange Pioneers, pastors of color have the racialized multicultural competency, which is rooted in their standpoint as racialized others in a white-dominated society, and this gives them insight to lead and guide multiracial space. They also have the potential to bridge racially segregated religious networks and act as brokers of these kinds of resources. That is, information and financial material resources that scholars of social mobilization tell us we need to generate social change. Our white brothers and sisters can use their white privilege and manifest in the respect and access that are afforded to provide communities for racial justice, access to the kinds of cultural capital and well-resourced social networks helpful for social change. But with attention to our current racialized context and movement toward actualizing this potential, there is hope for freedom just yet. So as we continue to move forward, we must think about our structures and where we're embedded and how we're going to integrate